I knew they were planning to erase me the moment I walked into that conference room and saw my nameplate had been replaced with two words, Team Support. Not Brand Strategy Director, as promised. Just support, like a backup battery. Only called upon during emergencies. But they forgot one crucial thing. I didn't just create that marketing campaign, I had copyrighted it. My name is Claire Bennett, and this is how I went from invisible to inevitable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stared at that pathetic nameplate, feeling my 7 years of expertise reduced to an afterthought. Logan Price stood at the head of the mahogany table, his perfectly pressed navy suit radiating the confidence of someone who had never created an original idea in his life. He was clicking through slides that made my stomach drop, slides containing every element of my emotive core funnels framework, presented as if they had materialized from his own brilliant mind. As you can see, Logan's voice carried that particular brand of corporate smugness. Our proprietary methodology has revolutionized how Ascendra Wearables connects with consumers on an emotional level. Proprietary, the word hung in the air like a slap. I watched the board members nod approvingly at charts showing the 340% increase in customer engagement, the viral social media campaigns, the brand loyalty scores that had skyrocketed beyond industry standards. All of it built on the foundation I had painstakingly constructed, brick by brick, over the past 7 years. I had arrived at Ascendra as a junior marketing coordinator fresh out of Northwestern, armed with theories about emotional resonance in consumer behavior that my professors had dismissed as too experimental. The company was struggling then, their wearable devices gathering dust in retail stores while competitors like Fitbit dominated the market. But I saw potential in the emotional data their devices collected: heart rate spikes during first dates, the calm patterns during meditation, the elevated readings during workout breakthroughs. The emotive core funnels framework hadn't emerged overnight. It was born from countless late nights analyzing consumer psychology, A/B testing emotional triggers, and mapping the precise moments when data became story. I identified 7 emotional touchpoints in the customer journey, each one carefully calibrated to transform users from casual buyers into brand evangelists. The methodology was so effective that Ascendra's market share grew from 3% to 28% in just 3 years. Yet here I sat, relegated to team support while Logan basked in applause for my life's work. The meeting dragged on for another 47 minutes. I knew the exact duration because I counted every second, my fingers drumming silently against my portfolio as Logan fielded questions about his innovative approach. When board member Margaret Steinberg asked about the theoretical underpinnings of the emotional mapping process, Logan fumbled, eventually deflecting with, "Claire can follow up with the technical details later." Later. Always later. That had become my perpetual role at Ascendra, the ghostwriter of their success story, summoned only to clean up messes or provide technical details when the spotlight became too hot for whoever was currently wearing my ideas like an expensive suit. The meeting finally ended, and I remained seated as executives filed out, their conversations already shifting to lunch plans and golf schedules. Logan approached my chair, his smile rehearsed and hollow. "Great work on the research support, Claire," he said, patting my shoulder with the patronizing touch of someone who had never doubted his right to take credit. "We'll need you to prepare a more detailed breakdown for the quarterly review." I looked up at him, this mediocre man who had climbed the corporate ladder by appropriating the innovations of people like me. "Of course," I replied evenly. "I'll make sure everything is properly documented." That afternoon, I returned to my cramped office, a converted supply closet they had upgraded me to after my 3rd year, and opened a folder on my laptop labeled "Lunch Break." Zip. To anyone casually glancing at my screen, it looked like a collection of food photos and restaurant reviews. In reality, it contained something far more valuable: 7 years of meticulously preserved evidence. Every draft email where I had outlined the emotional targeting strategies, screenshots of whiteboard sessions from 2018 where I had first sketched the funnel architecture, Slack message logs where I had proposed the specific language frameworks that became our most successful campaign slogans, voice memos I'd recorded during weekend brainstorming sessions, complete with timestamps proving the chronology of my innovation. I had started this digital insurance policy 3 years ago. After the first time Logan had presented my quarterly growth strategy to the C-suite without mentioning my name. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. I watched colleague after colleague get sidelined while their contributions were absorbed into the success narratives of their superiors. The folder now contained 847 files, each one a breadcrumb leading back to the true source of Ascendra's transformation. I wasn't just a woman with good ideas. I was a woman who had learned to leave an undeniable paper trail. 2 days later, the final insult arrived in the form of an all-hands email announcing Jared Morrison's promotion to senior brand strategist, the position I had been promised 6 months ago. Jared, whose previous marketing experience consisted of managing his fraternity's Instagram account and whose idea of consumer insight was, "People like free stuff." I stared at the congratulatory messages flooding our company Slack channel, watching colleagues offer enthusiasm for a man whose greatest professional achievement was successfully scheduling meetings. The position should have been mine. The title, the corner office, the budget authority, all of it should have reflected the reality of who was actually driving Ascendra's success. Instead, I got to watch Jared fumble through his acceptance speech during the afternoon meeting, promising to leverage synergistic paradigms and maximize our brand's market penetration across all consumer touchpoints. He spoke in corporate buzzwords the way other people speak in foreign languages they've never learned, confident that volume could substitute for comprehension. That evening, I made the decision that would change everything. I didn't storm out or schedule a dramatic confrontation with HR. I simply opened my laptop and began typing a resignation letter with the clinical precision of someone performing surgery. I need to schedule an exit interview. I told Samantha Walsh from Human Resources the next morning, dropping my resignation letter on her desk at exactly 6:00 p.m. The timing was deliberate, late enough that most executives had left for the day, but early enough that my departure would ripple through the evening email chains of middle management. Samantha blinked at me in confusion. "Exit interview, Claire. I didn't realize you were... Is everything okay? Did something happen?" "Everything is perfectly clear," I replied, maintaining the polite professional tone that had become my armor. "I'm transitioning to pursue other opportunities. 2 weeks' notice, as outlined in my contract." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in strategic silence. I completed my assigned projects, responded to emails with helpful transitions for my replacement, and attended meetings with the same collaborative demeanor that had defined my tenure. I didn't complain, didn't point fingers, didn't burn bridges. I simply became exceptionally, noticeably efficient, the kind of efficiency that makes people realize how much they depended on someone only after they're gone. Meanwhile, I was executing a parallel strategy that would prove far more consequential than any resignation letter. I had scheduled a consultation with Naomi Green, one of Chicago's most respected intellectual property attorneys, whose client list included several Fortune 500 companies and whose reputation for protecting creative professionals had made her a legend in legal circles. Naomi's office occupied the 42nd floor of a downtown skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more per month than most people's salaries. She was younger than I had expected, maybe 38, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog details the way a computer processes data. "Tell me about the timeline," she said after I had explained my situation and opened my laptop to show her the contents of lunch break. Zip. "When did you first develop these frameworks?" For the next 2 hours, I walked her through the evolution of emotive core funnels. From my initial consumer psychology research in 2018 through the iterative testing phases that had refined the methodology into its current form, Naomi asked pointed questions about my employment contract, my job responsibilities, and the specific language I had used in documenting my innovations. "The good news," she finally said, leaning back in her leather chair, "is that your documentation is extraordinary. The bad news is that intellectual property law in the marketing space can be complex, especially when dealing with methodologies developed during employment. But it can be done." "Oh, it can absolutely be done." Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes next. Filing for intellectual property protection on your work will make your departure from Ascendra significantly more complicated. I thought about Logan's condescending pat on my shoulder, about Jared's undeserved promotion, about 7 years of being treated like an interchangeable cog in a machine I had built. I'm prepared. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my studio apartment in Lincoln Park, surrounded by moving boxes and the modest setup that would become the headquarters of North Current Strategies. The name had come to me during a walk along the lakefront, watching the way the water carved new paths around obstacles. Sometimes the most powerful force is the one that flows around resistance rather than fighting it directly. My apartment wasn't much a converted loft with exposed brick walls and windows that faced an alley rather than the lake, but it was mine. No corporate hierarchy, no nameplate that could be changed on someone else's whim, no credit that could be stolen by men who confused authority with ability. The intellectual property filing had been submitted to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, with Naomi's legal team handling the complex documentation required to establish my ownership of the emotive core funnels methodology. It would take months to process, but the filing date created a legal timestamp that would prove crucial later. In the meantime, I needed clients, not just any clients, but the right kind of clients, companies with vision, budgets, and most importantly, leadership that understood the value of authentic innovation. That's when I discovered Atria Pulse. The company had emerged from stealth mode 6 months earlier, founded by Valeria Knox, a former neuroscientist turned entrepreneur who had developed wearable technology that could monitor stress responses in real time and provide personalized intervention strategies. The science was groundbreaking, but their marketing was forgettable generic fitness messaging that completely missed the revolutionary implications of their technology. I spent 3 days researching everything about Atria Pulse, from their patent filings to Valeria's academic publications to the venture capital firms that had invested in their Series A funding. Then I crafted a proposal that would either land me the biggest client of my nascent career or confirm that I had made a catastrophic mistake in leaving Ascendra. Valeria's office was located in a converted warehouse in the West Loop, its industrial aesthetic softened by living walls and natural lighting that felt more like a wellness retreat than a tech startup. She was younger than most CEOs, probably early 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had never wasted a moment of her life on anything that didn't serve her vision. "I've seen your work at Ascendra," she said without preamble, gesturing for me to sit across from her at a conference table made from reclaimed wood. "The emotional targeting campaigns were impressive, but I'm curious why you left." It was a test, and we both knew it. The wrong answer would end the meeting before it truly began. Because I realized that working for someone else's vision meant accepting someone else's limitations, I replied. Ascendra was satisfied with incremental improvements to an existing formula. I'm interested in building something entirely new. Show me. I opened my presentation, but instead of launching into slides about my previous success, I started with a single question. What if stress isn't something your customers need to eliminate, but something they need to understand? For the next hour, I outlined a marketing strategy that reframed Atria Pulse's technology not as another fitness tracker, but as a tool for emotional intelligence. Instead of promising to reduce stress, we would promise to decode it. Instead of targeting people who wanted to be healthier, we would target people who wanted to be more self-aware. The framework built on everything I'd learned, developing emotive core funnels. But it was evolved, refined, more sophisticated. I called it the narrative cascade system, a methodology that created deeply personalized stories about each user's emotional journey, turning data into meaning and meaning into brand loyalty. The traditional approach treats consumers like problems to be solved, I explained, clicking through mock-ups of campaigns that positioned stress as valuable information rather than unwanted noise. But what if we treated them like stories waiting to be told? Valeria asked sharp questions about implementation timelines, budget requirements, and measurable outcomes. She wanted to understand not just what I proposed to do, but how I planned to prove it was working. By the time I left her office 2 hours later, I had a verbal commitment to a 6-month pilot program with a budget that exceeded my annual salary at Ascendra. The next 4 months were a blur of 18-hour days, creativity sessions that lasted until dawn, and the kind of deep focus that only comes from working on something you own completely. The narrative cascade system wasn't just a rebrand of my previous work, it was a fundamental evolution that took emotional marketing into uncharted territory. Instead of targeting broad demographic segments, we created micro-campaigns for specific emotional states. Instead of selling benefits, we sold understanding. Instead of interrupting people's lives with advertising, we created content that helped them interpret their own experiences. The results were immediate and dramatic. Atria Pulse's customer acquisition costs dropped by 60%, while their lifetime value increased by 180%. Their social media engagement rates climbed to levels that industry analysts called unprecedented. Most importantly, their customers became evangelists, sharing stories about how the technology had helped them understand themselves in ways they had never imagined possible. The business press took notice. TechCrunch featured Atria Pulse in a cover story about the future of emotional wellness. Wired ran a deep dive on the psychology behind their marketing approach. Forbes included Valeria on their 30 Under 30 list, with specific mention of the company's revolutionary approach to consumer engagement. I watched the coverage from my apartment office, feeling a satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with validation. This was what happened when innovation was allowed to flourish without the constraints of corporate mediocrity. When someone's best ideas weren't filtered through layers of risk-averse management. But my contentment was shattered by a message from Marcus Rivera, a former colleague at Ascendra who had managed to maintain his integrity despite the toxic environment. The message contained a single link and a brief note. You need to see this. The link led to Ascendra's latest campaign announcement, a product launch event scheduled for the following month that would introduce their next-generation emotional intelligence platform. The preview materials made my stomach drop. Every element of the narrative cascade system was there, from the specific language frameworks to the micro-targeting methodologies to the exact positioning that reframed stress as valuable data. They hadn't just stolen my old work, they had somehow obtained access to my new innovations and were preparing to claim credit for the evolutionary leap I had spent months developing. The campaign materials even used the phrase emotional journey mapping terminology I had coined specifically for the Atria Pulse project. I stared at my laptop screen for a long time, feeling a cold rage that was different from the frustrated resignation I'd experienced during my final days at Ascendra. This wasn't about being overlooked or undervalued. This was theft, plain and simple, executed with the kind of brazen confidence that comes from believing your victims have no recourse. But they had miscalculated. 7 years of careful documentation and months of intellectual property preparation had built me an arsenal they couldn't see coming. I picked up my phone and called Naomi Green. "It's time," I said when she answered. "Are you sure once we send the cease and desist, there's no going back? This becomes a very public legal battle." I thought about Logan standing in that conference room, basking in applause for my work. I thought about Jared's undeserved promotion and the nameplate that had reduced me to team support. I thought about Valeria's trust and the months of innovation that Ascendra was preparing to steal. I'm sure the cease and desist letter was a work of art. 23 pages of precisely crafted legal language that detailed exactly how Ascendra had infringed on my intellectual property rights. But more importantly, it was timed with surgical precision to arrive at their corporate headquarters at 10:00 a.m. on the day of their product launch event. The launch was being live-streamed to an audience of industry analysts, potential investors, and technology journalists. Logan had spent weeks promoting it on LinkedIn, promising to reveal breakthrough innovations in emotional commerce that would revolutionize how brands connect with consumers. I watched the stream from my apartment, my laptop positioned so I could see both the presentation and the real-time social media reactions. For the first 30 minutes, everything proceeded according to Logan's script. He walked through market research, competitor analysis, and customer pain points with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Then he reached the slide that changed everything. Our proprietary narrative cascade system, Logan announced, clicking to a presentation that featured the exact framework I'd developed for Atria Pulse, represents a fundamental shift in how we understand consumer psychology. That's when the notification appeared on his laptop screen, visible to the livestream audience, urgent legal notice received. I watched Logan's face change as he read something off camera, his practiced confidence cracking like ice on a warming lake. The presentation had frozen on a slide that prominently featured the term narrative cascade system, with a small but clearly visible trademark symbol that hadn't been there in rehearsals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Logan stammered, "we're experiencing some technical difficulties. If you could give us just a moment." But the internet doesn't pause for damage control. Screenshots of the frozen slide were already circulating on Twitter, with marketing professionals pointing out the suspicious timing of the technical difficulties. Within minutes, someone had identified the connection between the trademark terminology and my recent work with Atria Pulse. The hashtag #bursts narrative cascade gate began trending as the livestream audience watched Logan struggle to regain control of a presentation that had become evidence of intellectual property theft. The comments section filled with industry insiders who recognized the methodology from my previous work and were connecting the dots in real time. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't post on social media or issue statements to the press. I simply let the evidence speak for itself while Naomi's legal team released a brief statement confirming that North Current Strategies held exclusive intellectual property rights to the framework being presented. The next 72 hours were a case study in corporate crisis management gone wrong. Ascendra's stock price dropped 15% as investors questioned the company's innovation pipeline and ethical standards. The live stream recording, which should have been a triumph of marketing sophistication, became viral content for all the wrong reasons. Logan disappeared from social media entirely. The official company statement claimed he was taking voluntary leave to address personal matters. But industry insiders understood what that euphemism really meant. You don't come back from stealing intellectual property on a live-streamed presentation watched by thousands of people. Meanwhile, the business press was having a field day. Marketing industry publications ran extensive analyses of how the incident exposed problems with idea attribution in corporate environments. Harvard Business Review commissioned an article on intellectual property protection for creative professionals. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and consulting inquiries. But the most satisfying moment came in the form of an email from Ascendra's new interim CMO, a woman named Patricia Chang, who had been brought in to clean up the mess Logan had created. The subject line was simple: conversation request. The email was professionally written and appropriately humble, acknowledging that mistakes had been made and expressing interest in exploring opportunities for collaboration. It included an offer to return to Ascendra as Senior Vice President of Brand Innovation, with a compensation package that was triple my previous salary and equity options that would make me one of the company's largest individual shareholders. I read the email 3 times, then moved it to my trash folder without responding. That evening, Valeria and I met at a rooftop bar in River North, the city lights spreading out below us like a circuit board of possibilities. She had just closed a Series B funding round that valued Atria Pulse at $200 million, with investors specifically citing the company's revolutionary marketing approach as a key factor in their decision. "To authorship," she said, raising her glass of wine. "To authorship," I agreed, clinking my glass against hers. Because that's what this had really been about. Not revenge, though it had certainly felt satisfying to watch Logan's public humiliation. Not money. Though the success of North Current Strategies had proven more lucrative than I had dared to imagine, it was about the fundamental right to tell your own story, to claim credit for your own innovations, to exist in the professional world as more than just support for someone else's ambitions. 3 months later, North Current Strategies had a waiting list of clients and a team of 12 employees working out of a proper office in the Loop. The narrative cascade system had been licensed to 6 different companies, each implementation generating both revenue and case studies that established my methodology as the new standard for emotional marketing. I kept the original studio apartment, though, converting it into a private office where I could work on the projects that required absolute focus. The exposed brick walls were now covered with whiteboards displaying frameworks for future innovations, and the windows that once faced an alley now seemed to offer a view of infinite possibility. Logan Price never returned to Ascendra. According to my former colleagues who still worked there, he had taken a position with a small agency in Denver. His LinkedIn profile scrubbed of any mention of his previous innovations in emotional marketing. Jared Morrison had been quietly reassigned to customer service, where his enthusiasm for synergistic paradigms could be channeled into more appropriate directions. The intellectual property lawsuit was settled out of court, with terms that included both financial compensation and a public acknowledgement of my ownership of the disputed frameworks. But more importantly, it established legal precedent that would protect other creative professionals from similar exploitation. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had stayed at Ascendra, if I had accepted the invisible role they had assigned me and continued supporting other people's careers with my innovations. The safe choice would have been to keep my head down, collect my modest salary, and hope that eventually someone would notice my contributions. But safety had never been the point. Innovation requires risk. And the biggest risk of all is believing that you deserve credit for your own ideas. It had taken 7 years of careful documentation and months of strategic planning. But I had finally learned to tell my own story. And now, no one could take that away from me. The nameplate on my office door reads, Claire Bennett, Founder and CEO. Not Team Support, not Brand Strategy Director. Just my name, my title. And the quiet confidence that comes from owning both your failures and your successes. The game had changed, and this time, I was holding all the cards.